Eli was born in a quiet mountain village where the sky seemed to touch the rooftops, and every dawn carried the sound of church bells echoing across the valleys. He was a small boy with wide, searching eyes, and his world was one of rituals, the scent of candles burning in the chapel, the low hum of hymns, and the soft voice of his mother as she knelt each night, guiding his tiny hands together in prayer. She told him that the sky was full of love, that every star was an eye watching over him. Eli believed her, because mothers do not lie. But then, his mother became ill. At first, it was only a cough, light and harmless. The villagers prayed for her, their voices rising like smoke into the heavens. Eli prayed the hardest of them all. He knelt by his bed, his small hands trembling, whispering, "Please, don't take her away." Days turned into weeks, and the prayers grew louder, but the cough worsened. The boy sat by her bedside, his little head resting against her frail arm. Listening to her breaths grew shallower, each one like a fading note of music. One night, Eli followed his father to the chapel. The room was filled with candlelight and shadow, the priest standing before the altar, his hands raised to the heavens. "God is testing us," the priest said. Eli's father repeated the words, but the boy didn't understand. Why would someone who loved them want to hurt them? He stared at the crucifix above the altar, at the silent face of the man nailed to it, and waited for it to move, to speak, to give him a reason. But it never did. When his mother died, the sky was painfully blue. The villagers carried her in a wooden coffin down the narrow path to the cemetery. Eli held his father's hand tightly, his small body trembling with confusion and grief. The priest said she was with God now, but the boy looked up and saw only clouds drifting lazily across the vast, empty sky. That night, he knelt by the window and whispered, "If you're up there, please, give her back." The stars stared down at him, cold and indifferent. Eli stopped going to the chapel after that. Instead, he wandered the meadows and climbed the hills that surrounded the village, staring at the endless horizon. He began to wonder if the silence was not just an answer, but the only truth. He spent hours sitting under the great oak tree that stood near the edge of the village. Its roots tangled like ancient veins. It was the place where his father once prayed with him. But now Eli simply watched the sky. Sometimes Ma, a girl his age with braids and bright, innocent faith, would sit beside him and say, "God is listening. Eli, you just have to believe harder." But Eli only shook his head. If he was listening, he wouldn't have taken her. Mara didn't know how to answer that, so she just sat quietly with him, their small hands resting in the grass. Seasons passed. In winter, Eli would sit by the window, tracing shapes in the frost, his breath fogging the glass. In spring, he wandered through the fields of wild flowers, wondering if beauty existed not because of God, but in spite of him. Each night, he returned to the oak tree, whispering to the stars. Not prayers, but questions. Why is it so quiet? Why does it feel like no one's there? No one ever answered. But strangely, the silence stopped frightening him. It became familiar, like an old friend. One evening, a storm rolled through the mountains. The wind howled. Rain battered the rooftops, and lightning split the sky in blinding white. The villagers crowded into the chapel, praying loudly for protection. But Eli stood alone under the oak tree, soaked to the bone, watching nature rage without purpose or reason. And in that chaos, he felt something, an understanding. The storm wasn't sent by anyone. It wasn't a test. It simply was. And if the world could exist without someone controlling it, Maybe he could too. After the storm, the village emerged to find the chapel steeple broken, its cross shattered by lightning. The priest called it a trial from God. Eli, standing in the mud, only stared at the fallen cross and thought, "No, it's just the wind." And for the first time, he felt free. As the years passed, Eli grew quieter, but his mind burned with curiosity. He read every book he could find, not just the holy ones, but stories of the stars, the earth, and the people who sought answers not in heaven but in themselves. Mara still came to him, still prayed, still believed. But sometimes, when they sat together under the oak tree, she listened to him talk about the universe, about how vast it was and how small they were, and for a moment, even her faith seemed to waver, just a little. One autumn evening, as the sun painted the sky in gold and crimson, Eli stood on the hill above the village and looked out at the world. He thought of his mother, of the prayers that had gone unanswered, and of the silence that had once broken his heart. But now, he didn't see silence as emptiness. He saw it as a canvas one he could fill with his own meaning, and as the stars began to appear, one by one, Eli smiled for the first time in years. Because he finally understood. If there was no one listening, then everything, every laugh, every tear, every fleeting moment was infinitely precious. And in that truth, the small boy who once begged the sky for answers no longer needed them. He had found his own. Eli grew quieter after that autumn on the hill. His father worked long hours, his face lined with the weight of grief, but Eli spent most of his days wandering. He loved the forests at the edge of the village, where sunlight filtered through the leaves like strands of gold, and the air smelled of moss and rain. He would sit by the brook, throwing pebbles into the water, and wonder if the world was beautiful because of some grand design or simply because it was. Sometimes he spoke aloud, as if the trees were listening. "If no one made you, how are you so perfect?" The forest never replied, but Eli no longer expected it to. As winter returned, snow blanketed the rooftops, turning the village into a quiet world of white and shadow. The chapel bells rang louder in the cold air, and the priest's sermons grew more fiery, warning the villagers not to stray from faith. But Eli, now bolder in his thoughts, stopped attending. He would sneak away to the oak tree while the others prayed, sitting on its roots and staring at the sky, breath clouding in the freezing air. Mara sometimes followed him, her cheeks pink from the cold. "You should come inside," she'd say softly. But Eli only shook his head. "If I stay in there, I can't hear myself think." Mara didn't understand, but she sat with him anyway, their silence warmer than any sermon. One day, Eli found a book hidden in his father's old chest-tattered atlas filled with drawings of stars and planets. He pored over it for hours, tracing constellations with his fingers. For the first time, he imagined a universe so vast it made the village chapel seem smaller than a grain of sand. That night, under the oak tree, he lay on his back and tried to connect the stars like the atlas showed him. "If no one's up there," he whispered, "maybe that's okay. Maybe it's better this way." He didn't know why, but for the first time, he didn't feel afraid. Spring came with gentle rains and new blossoms, and Eli began to change. He asked questions the priest didn't like, questions about why prayers went unanswered, why storms destroyed homes, why good people died while cruel ones thrived. The priest scolded him in front of the congregation, calling his curiosity dangerous. Eli's father lowered his head in shame, but Eli only clenched his fists. He didn't want to be dangerous. He just wanted the truth. Mara cried that night, begging him to stop asking, but Eli couldn't. "If no one asks," he said, We'll never know. One summer night, a festival lit the village square with lanterns and laughter. Eli stood apart from the crowd, watching the sky rather than the fireworks. Mara joined him, holding to pieces of honey bread. "You'll miss everything," she teased, handing him one. Eli bit into it and pointed upward. "No," he said with a small smile. "This is the only show I want to see." And as they lay in the grass beneath the oak tree, lanterns floating up like tiny stars, Eli realized something: he didn't need heaven. The sky was already enough. But then came the drought. The crops failed, and the villagers grew desperate. They prayed every day, their voices hoarse, begging for rain. Eli, too, stood beneath the dry sky and stared at the pitiless sun. When nothing happened, the priest blamed sinners, glaring at Eli as though his questions had angered the heavens. Some villagers whispered that he was cursed. Eli sat under the oak tree that night, fists clenched, rage boiling in his chest. "If you're real," he shouted at the stars, "then why punish them for me?" The stars, as always, gave no reply. And then, without warning, one morning the rain came not because of prayers, but because the clouds simply gathered and broke. The villagers wept in joy, praising God. But Eli stood in the rain, laughing bitterly. He realized it wasn't a miracle. It was just the sky doing what it always did. For the first time, he saw the world as it truly was: vast, wild, and free of any hand but its own. When the storm ended, Eli returned to the oak tree and carved his mother's name into its trunk. "You'd like it here," he whispered. "It's quiet. No one tells you what to believe." Mara found him there, tears running down his face. She didn't try to argue this time. She only sat with him, leaning her head on his shoulder, the silence between them no longer lonely but alive. As the sun set, Eli looked at the horizon and thought of his mother, of the boy he used to be, and of the silence he had once hated. Now, it was beautiful. The world didn't need a voice from the sky. It had the wind, the stars, and the sound of Mara's quiet breathing beside him. For a boy who once begged for answers, that was enough. Summer returned with a gentleness Eli hadn't felt in years. The fields turned green again. The river swelled with clear water. And for a while, the village seemed at peace. Eli spent most of his days by the oak tree, sketching in a small notebook he had found in his father's old desk. He drew the branches, the roots, the sky above it, and sometimes faces he could barely remember: his mother's, soft and smiling, her hair like sunlight. Each line felt like a conversation he was having with the world, as though by drawing it, he was learning to see it more clearly. One afternoon, Mara came running up the hill, a basket of apples in arms. She sat beside Eli, chewing on one as she watched him sketch. "You never pray anymore," she said quietly. Eli didn't look up. "I don't need to," he replied. "If no one's listening, then praying is just talking to yourself." Mara frowned. "And you're okay with that?" Eli stopped drawing, turned to her, and smiled faintly. "Maybe that's the point. Maybe we're supposed to talk to ourselves, because we're the only ones who can answer." Mara didn't argue this time. Instead, she leaned against the tree beside him, watching the clouds drift lazily across the sky. That night, Eli couldn't sleep. He slipped out of his home and climbed the hill alone. The oak tree loomed tall and ancient under the starlight, and the village below was quiet. He lay on his back and stared upward, the stars so many and so bright they almost hurt his eyes. For a moment, he felt smaller than he had ever felt before, but instead of fear, he felt wonder. The universe didn't know his name, but it didn't need to. It was enough just to exist in it. He whispered, "If this is all there is, it's beautiful." As weeks passed, Eli began to notice things others overlooked, the way sunlight caught in a spider's web, turning it into strands of silver. How the wind made the tall grass sway like waves. How every raindrop seemed to carry a tiny reflection of the world. He no longer searched for signs from above because every little thing round him felt like its own quiet miracle, one that didn't need a god to explain it. But not everyone saw what he saw. One day, the priest cornered him in the village square. "You lead others astray with your questions," the priest scolded. "Doubt is a sickness." Boy, Eli stood there, small but unshaken. "If it's sickness," he said softly, "then why does it feel like breathing?" The priest had no answer. Mara overheard and later told him, "You shouldn't talk like that. They'll never understand." Eli just shrugged. "They don't have to." That autumn, Eli spent nearly every evening by the oak tree. The leaves turned gold and red, falling round him like fire from the sky. He carved little marks into the tree's bark for every day he spent there, until the trunk was covered in a map of his childhood, a record of the days he stopped needing the heavens. Mara joined him sometimes, but mostly she just listened now, watching him trace constellations with his fingertip in the night sky. One evening, as the wind rustled through the branches, Eli whispered to his mother's name carved into the trunk. "I think I understand now. You are not up there. You're here." In me, he didn't expect an answer, and none came. But somehow, the silence felt like a hand on his shoulder, warm and steady. And from that night on, Eli no longer looked to the sky for someone to speak. He began to live as if the silence itself was the answer, because it let him fill it with his own voice. Winter fell upon the village like a great white curtain. Days grew shorter, and the sun, pale and distant, barely warmed the ground before vanishing again. Snow piled high along the rooftops, muting every sound until the world seemed made of silence. Eli wandered through it all, his small boots crunching in the frost, his breath rising like smoke. He didn't fear the winter anymore. He almost loved it. To him, there was something honest about its coldness, something that didn't pretend to be kind. Most nights, Eli climbed the hill to his oak tree. Its branches stood black against the sky, heavy with snow, a silent sentinel watching over the world. He would sit beneath it, notebook on his lap, sketching the shapes of the stars even when clouds hid them. He no longer waited for answers. He simply existed there, and somehow it felt enough. But this winter was different. The villagers were restless. The fields were buried deep in frost. And whispers of hunger crept through the cold air. The priest's voice rang louder in the chapel, warning of doubt that invites punishment. Eli heard his name more than once in those sermons, though he wasn't there to listen. One night, his father stopped him at the door. "Stay inside, Eli," he said, his voice tired but firm. "The cold will kill you one of these days." Eli only smiled faintly. "It won't. I'm not going far." His father's eyes softened with a grief that never truly left him, not since Eli's mother died. But he said nothing, and Eli slipped out into the night. The hilltop was quiet, blanketed in untouched snow. Eli brushed a place clear at the base of the oak tree and sat, his back against the bark where his mother's name was carved. He tilted his head and stared at the sky. The stars were hidden tonight, but he didn't mind. He whispered into the silence, "If you're up there, I'm not angry anymore. But if you're not, I think I'm okay with that too." The wind answered only with a low sigh through the branches. And Eli smiled. Then everything changed. The wind stopped. The night grew unnaturally still, as if the entire world had paused. Eli froze, his breath clouding in the air, and for a moment he thought his ears had gone deaf. No rustle of trees, no crunch of snow, nothing. And then he saw it, a faint, shimmering glow on the horizon, beyond the edge of the forest. It wasn't lantern light. It wasn't the moon. It was something else. He stood slowly, heart pounding. The glow pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat, painting the snow in pale silver. His small fists tightened at his sides, and 1,000 thoughts collided in his mind. Could it be a sign, a mistake, a dream? Behind him, a voice shattered the silence. Eli. He turned. Mara was there. Her coat thrown over her night clothes, her cheeks red from the cold. She ran up the hill, slipping in the snow. "Don't go near it," she cried, her voice trembling not from the cold, but from fear. But Eli barely heard her. The light was growing brighter. "I have to see it," he whispered, more to himself than to her. His feet moved before he could stop them, snow crunching louder now, each step heavier than the last. Mara caught his sleeve, tugging hard. "Please, Eli." "What if it's—" But she didn't finish, because in that moment the glow shifted. It rose, as though lifting itself from the horizon, and spread across the sky in delicate ribbons of pale silver and violet. "Like 1,000 strands of silk unraveling in the dark," Mara gasped. Even Ellie's breath caught in his chest. It was unlike anything he had ever seen, neither star nor storm nor fire. It was something else entirely, and for one brief, impossible moment. Eli felt his mother, not in the sky, not in the light, but in himself and the quiet. Steady beat of his heart, he almost called out her name, but the words never came. Then, as suddenly as it appeared, the light flickered and vanished. Darkness returned. The wind howled again. The oak tree groaned in the cold. Eli stood frozen, snow clinging to his boots. Mara clutching his arm with wide, tear-bright eyes. Neither spoke. The world was silent once more. But the silence was different now. It felt waiting. Finally, Mara broke the quiet, her voice barely above a whisper. "What was that?" Eli didn't look at her. He stared at the horizon, where the glow had been, and for the first time in his life, he didn't want an answer. He only said, "It doesn't matter," and then he smiled small, tired, but unshakable. "The sky is empty, Mara, and that's the most beautiful thing in the world." They walked back down the hill together. Mara kept glancing behind her, at the oak tree, as if afraid it might follow. She didn't see what Eli saw, the faintest glimmer of silver still etched into the bark where his mother's name was carved. It was there only for him, a secret the world wasn't ready to share. And as the wind swept over the hill, Eli didn't feel small anymore. He didn't feel lost. For the first time in his life, he felt infinite, but somewhere deep in the silence, far beyond where any prayer could reach, the oak tree creaked, as if it had heard him.